6 blades, spinning at once, 4 arms that should not exist. This is what Jedi Masters saw in the last seconds of their lives. Not a Sith, not a dark side user. Something worse. Something the Force itself never prepared them for. He hunted Jedi one at a time, across dozens of worlds, for years. Every kill earned him a trophy. He took their lightsaber from their dead hand and wore it on his chest, next to the last one, and the one before that. By the end, he had collected more of them than almost any other single threat in galactic history. But here is what almost nobody asks about him. Who built this thing? Because he was not born a killer. Somebody made him one, on purpose, and the reason why is darker than anything you have heard about him yet. It starts with a name nobody remembers anymore. Not the name that made him feared. A different one. A name that belonged to a husband, a war hero, a man who loved someone and was loved back, right up until the moment that love got used as a weapon against him. Every kill that came after, every trophy, every warning whispered between clone troopers on 100 battlefields traces back to one engineered betrayal, one moment that changed everything. To understand the monster, you first have to meet the man they destroyed to build him. Long before the Clone Wars, long before the droid armies and the Separatist crisis, there was a world called Kaylee, a green and mountainous planet on the edges of civilized space, where a proud and warlike species called the Kaleesh lived according to codes of honor that stretched back further than most galactic records could confirm. The Kaleesh were not gentle people. Their history was written in feuds and blood debts, in ritual combat and clan loyalty, in a warrior culture that prized strength and cunning above nearly everything else. Among them was born a male named Kiminjai Shilal, a name that would later be erased so completely from most records that entire generations of beings across the galaxy would only ever know him by the identity built on top of it. As a young Kaleesh, Kimain distinguished himself quickly. He was tall, lean, disciplined, possessed of a mind that absorbed tactics and strategy the way other children absorbed games. Kali at that time was locked in a brutal, generations-long war against an insectoid species called the Yamri, sometimes referred to as the Hook, over territory, resources, and old grievances that neither side could fully articulate anymore because the war itself had outlived the reasons for starting it. Entire Kaleesh generations were raised knowing nothing but combat against the Hook. Kimain was one of them. He rose through the ranks of Kali's warrior society with a speed that unsettled his elders. By the time he reached adulthood, he was already leading raids, already being whispered about in war councils, already earning the kind of reputation that either gets a young warrior killed early or turns him into a legend. He proved to be the second kind. His tactical mind was ruthless and inventive. Where older commanders favored honor duels and traditional formations, Kimain studied the Hook's weaknesses with a cold, almost clinical eye, and he was willing to use methods his own people considered dishonorable if it meant winning. He orchestrated ambushes. He targeted supply lines. He used misinformation and psychological terror as weapons long before he ever wore a scrap of metal on his body. Some Kaleesh admired him for finally giving them the upper hand in a war they had been slowly losing. Others distrusted him, sensing something colder underneath his brilliance, something that valued victory over the old codes of honor his people claimed to live by. Both groups were right. though none of them yet understood how right they were. It was during this period that Kaimain met and fell for a Kalish woman named Rondaru Liege Kumar, herself a warrior of considerable skill and standing within her clan. Their courtship was, by most accounts, fierce and passionate in the way that Kalish romance tended to be, built on mutual respect for strength as much as any softer sentiment. Rondaru was not a woman who could be won through gentleness, and Kaimain did not attempt gentleness. He won her through demonstrated competence, through shared purpose, through the kind of partnership that Kalish culture considered the highest form of devotion between two warriors. They were, by every account that survives, deeply devoted to each other. It is important to hold on to this fact, because almost everything that came afterward was built on the ashes of it. As Kaimain's military reputation grew, so did his political influence. He became a figure, not just on the battlefield, but in the councils of Kali's warlords, eventually rising to a position that combined military command with genuine political power over his people's war effort. This made him valuable. It also made him a target, not from the Hook, who feared him plainly and directly, but from forces far more patient and far more dangerous, forces that had been watching the war on Kali from a distance and calculating how a being like Kaimain might be useful to purposes far larger than one planet's border dispute. The war between the Kalish and the Hook did not exist in a vacuum. Off-world powers had taken an interest in Kali's natural resources and strategic position, and among those powers was a shadowy network of interests that would later coalesce into the movement known as the Separatist Alliance, though at the time it had no such name and no such public face. Behind these interests, quietly and invisibly, moved a political operator who had already spent years positioning pieces across the galaxy for a war that had not yet begun in the eyes of anyone but him. Count Dooku, former Jedi Master turned political dissident, turned secret apprentice to a Sith Lord, whose existence the galaxy did not yet suspect, had a talent for finding broken or brilliant individuals and offering them exactly what they needed to hear. He did not approach Kaimain directly, not at first. Instead, he worked through intermediaries, feeding resources and influence to Kali's war effort in ways that were never traced back to their true source, all while quietly studying the young Kalish commander from a distance, weighing whether he might be useful. What Dooku found interested him greatly. Here was a being of extraordinary tactical brilliance, ruthless enough to win, proud enough to be manipulated through his pride, and increasingly convinced that his own people's leadership was too weak and too traditional to finish the war properly. Kaimain had begun to believe that Kali's civilian government was holding back the war effort, hampering strategies that could end the conflict decisively in favor of slower, more cautious approaches that cost more Kalish lives in the long run. This resentment, carefully nurtured by unseen hands feeding him selective information and subtle encouragement, grew into something closer to contempt. Kaimain began to see himself as the only one capable of truly saving his people, and he began to see the political structures around him as obstacles rather than partners. This is the exact moment when the trap was set, though Kaimain would not understand it as a trap until it was far too late to matter. He was invited, along with several other prominent Kalish military and political figures, to a summit meant to negotiate a resolution to certain internal disputes about the war's direction. Rondeau traveled with him. The journey required a shuttle flight over Kali's mountainous terrain, a routine transport that thousands of similar flights had completed without incident. This one did not complete without incident. Partway through the flight, the shuttle suffered a catastrophic and completely unnatural failure, an explosion that tore through the vessel with a violence that had nothing to do with mechanical malfunction and everything to do with deliberate sabotage. The shuttle plummeted from the sky in flames. Humane survived the initial blast, though barely, his body shredded and burning as the wreckage fell toward the mountains below. He would later learn, though only much later and only in fragments, that the sabotage had been arranged by the very interests that had been quietly courting him, that the summit itself may have been engineered specifically to place him and several key rivals on that shuttle at that moment, that his usefulness to certain unseen architects depended on him surviving in a state broken enough to be remade entirely. Rondeau did not survive. The woman who had fought beside him, loved him, and shared his vision for what Kali could become, died in the wreckage of a shuttle brought down specifically to break the man she loved into something that could be rebuilt without her. Kimine was found in the wreckage barely alive, his organic body catastrophically damaged beyond anything Kalish medicine could hope to repair. Under ordinary circumstances, he would have died within minutes of rescue. But these were not ordinary circumstances, and the beings who arrived to collect him from the wreckage were not ordinary rescuers. They came from the Techno-Union, one of the great industrial and technological powers, quietly aligning itself with Count Dooku's growing separatist movement, and their leadership, particularly a Geonosian named San Hill, working in close coordination with Dooku's shadowy design, had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. A brilliant tactical mind, freshly broken, freshly grieving, freshly furious, with a body destroyed badly enough that almost nothing organic needed to be preserved except what could serve a larger purpose. It was, from a certain monstrous point of view, an ideal foundation to build upon. What followed was not medicine in any sense a healer would recognize. It was construction, over a grueling process that stretched across an unknown span of time. Geonosian surgeons and Techno-Union engineers stripped away what remained of Kimane's ruined body and replaced it, piece by piece, with cybernetic architecture engineered specifically for combat. His brain was preserved and encased. Certain vital organs, considered too complex or too essential to replace outright, were kept and housed within a chest plate designed to protect them, a chest plate that would later become his single greatest and most carefully guarded vulnerability. Though almost no one in the galaxy would ever learn that secret and live to use it against him, except for a very select few. Everything else, his arms, now doubled to 4, in a design that echoed nothing natural about Kalish anatomy, but everything about maximizing lethal efficiency in melee combat. His legs, his spine, his very posture was rebuilt from durasteel and internal machinery. When the process was finished, there was very little left of the war hero who had led Kalish armies against the Hook. In his place stood something new, something the engineers and Dooku's agents did not even bother to name with dignity. They called him a droid general. He would spend the rest of his existence being referred to quietly and pointedly as something less than fully alive, an irony that would fuel a rage he carried until the very end. Dooku visited him during his recovery, and this meeting would prove to be the true beginning of the monster the galaxy would come to fear. Dooku did not offer comfort, he offered purpose. He told the newly rebuilt warrior, who would soon take the name Grievous, a name deliberately chosen for how it sounded, how it landed on the ear like an accusation and a threat all at once, that the weakness of institutions like the Jedi Order and the corrupt Galactic Republic were responsible, however indirectly, for the chaos and manipulation that had cost him everything. It was, of course, a monstrous lie built on top of a genuine tragedy, since it had been Dooku's own faction that arranged the very sabotage that destroyed Kimane in the first place, and it had been the Techno-Union and Geonosian interests aligned with Dooku who chose to rebuild him for their own purposes rather than let him die with whatever remained of his humanity intact. But Grievous, in his grief and fury and disorientation, could not see the trap closing around him even as he stood inside its jaws. He accepted Dooku's framing entirely. He came to believe that the Jedi, as the guardians and enforcers of the Republic's authority, bore ultimate responsibility for every injustice done to smaller worlds like Kaylee, for every war that dragged on because larger galactic powers found it convenient, for the very institutional failures that Dooku claimed had led indirectly to his crippling. A hatred was planted in him that had nothing to do with any Jedi ever having wronged him personally, and everything to do with a carefully constructed narrative designed to turn a broken war hero into a weapon pointed at a very specific target. Dooku trained him personally in the use of the lightsaber, an unusual and telling choice given that Grievous was not Force-sensitive in any meaningful sense, and could never wield the weapon the way a Jedi or Sith did, drawing on the Force to guide his strikes and sense his opponent's intentions. Instead, Grievous's mastery of the blade was built entirely on cybernetic precision, on reflexes calibrated far beyond organic limits, on the raw physical capacity to wield multiple lightsabers simultaneously in configurations no living swordsman could manage, and on a student's obsessive, disciplined study of every recorded lightsaber duel and combat form he could access. Where a Jedi felt the fight, Grievous calculated it, processing movement and counter-movement with a machine's cold precision. Dooku, a master of the elegant and aristocratic Makashi form himself, found in Grievous a student whose approach to combat was almost the philosophical opposite of everything the Jedi Order valued: discipline without serenity, mastery without wisdom, lethal efficiency completely divorced from anything resembling inner peace. It made him, in a very real sense, the perfect anti-Jedi, a being who could match a lightsaber wielder blade for blade, without ever once drawing on the spiritual dimension that the Jedi and Sith, both in their very different ways, considered inseparable from swordsmanship itself. As separatist ambitions crystallized into an organized movement, and the galaxy inched closer to the war that would eventually be called the Clone Wars, Grievous was elevated to Supreme Commander of the Confederacy of Independent Systems droid armies, placed at the absolute pinnacle of separatist military power. It was a position that suited him perfectly, since it gave him command over the largest mechanized army the galaxy had ever seen, while also allowing him personal freedom to pursue what had become his true obsession: hunting and killing Jedi with his own 4 hands. Even before the formal outbreak of galaxy-wide war, Grievous had already begun a private campaign of terror. one that the Jedi Order would only piece together gradually, in fragments, through missing patrols, disappeared diplomats, and the slow, horrifying realization that a pattern connected them all. His earliest confirmed Jedi kills came during the tense years of building Crisis before Geonosis, when separatist sympathizing worlds occasionally required more direct persuasion than politics alone could provide, and Jedi were sometimes sent, quietly, to investigate disappearances, sabotage, or suspicious military buildups on the edges of separatist territory. Grievous made a habit of ensuring that Jedi sent to investigate him personally never returned to make their reports. He was patient in these early hunts, studying his targets, learning their reputations, their fighting styles, their weaknesses, before ever engaging them directly. He wanted, from the very beginning, not just to kill Jedi, but to understand them intimately enough that killing them became almost a formality, the culmination of a hunt rather than the surprise of an ambush. Each kill, from the earliest days of his campaign, became a trophy. He took the fallen Jedi's lightsaber, cleaned it, catalogued it, and added it to a growing collection that he wore across his chest and stored within specially constructed compartments in his own body. A collection that grew steadily throughout the years of war that followed, until it became one of the most gruesome and instantly recognizable features of his appearance. To the wider galaxy, this collection eventually became legend, whispered about by clone troopers around campfires and debated in hushed tones within the Jedi Temple itself. But to Grievous, the collection was never mere decoration. Each blade represented a specific victory, a specific name, a specific memory of a fight he had won against beings the entire galaxy considered nearly untouchable. It was proof, worn openly on his body, that he was not the broken thing Dooku and the Techno-Union had assembled him to be, but something greater than the very Jedi Order that he had come to blame for the destruction of his old life. As the Clone Wars finally erupted in full following the disastrous confrontation on Geonosis, Grievous's campaign against the Jedi shifted from a quiet, patient hunt into something far more brazen and far more terrifying. A public and relentless war fought across 1,000 fronts simultaneously. He commanded fleets. He orchestrated invasions. He personally led droid forces into battle against Jedi generals commanding clone armies. And time and again, he sought out these Jedi commanders, specifically treating entire military campaigns as extended opportunities to add to his collection. Jedi across the galaxy began to understand, with growing dread, that engaging Grievous directly in melee combat was almost never a survivable decision unless they had significant numerical advantage or extraordinary skill. And even then, the odds were far worse than most were willing to admit openly. The Jedi Council took the threat he posed with the utmost seriousness from remarkably early in the war, dedicating significant resources and intelligence gathering specifically to tracking his movements, his likely targets, and any pattern that might predict where he would strike next. Reports filtered back to the temple, describing encounters that defied easy explanation. Clone troopers recounting how their Jedi general had been overwhelmed not by droid numbers but by a single towering, coughing figure who moved faster than organic reflexes should allow, wielding blades in all four hands with a fluidity that seemed almost mocking of traditional lightsaber forms. Some of these reports came from survivors. Many did not. Among the Jedi who fell to him during these years were experienced masters, and talented knights alike. Individuals whose deaths sent shockwaves through the Order precisely because their skill and experience had made them seem, before their encounters with Grievous, nearly unassailable. He did not discriminate based on reputation. If anything, the more formidable a Jedi's reputation, the more determined he became to add their lightsaber to his collection, treating the galaxy's most celebrated warriors as the most prestigious trophies available to him. Word of these confrontations spread through the ranks of the Order with a speed that outpaced official reports, whispered in corridors of the Jedi Temple, discussed in hushed, worried tones between masters who had spent decades believing that no threat outside the Sith themselves could truly terrify their Order. Grievous proved them wrong, and he did it with a savage, personal directness that made him feel less like a strategic threat to be managed and more like a monster stalking them individually, one by one, wherever they went. It became common practice, as the war progressed, for Jedi generals to be briefed specifically on Grievous protocol, contingency plans built entirely around what to do if he appeared personally on a battlefield rather than simply directing his droid forces from a distance. Younger Jedi Knights, still building their combat reputations, were quietly discouraged from engaging him alone under almost any circumstances, a directive that stung the pride of many, but that the Council enforced with unusual firmness, given how rarely they intervened so directly in individual Jedi's tactical decisions. Some ignored the warnings anyway, driven by confidence in their own abilities or by desperate battlefield circumstances that left them no other choice. And Grievous, ever patient, ever willing to let overconfidence walk directly into his waiting blades, collected their weapons in turn. Perhaps most unsettling to the Jedi Order was not simply the number of casualties Grievous inflicted, but the manner in which he inflicted them. He was not merely dangerous in combat, he was theatrical about his danger, deliberately cultivating an aura of inevitability and terror that spread ahead of him like a shadow, ensuring that Jedi facing him for the first time already carried the psychological weight of every story they had heard about him before a single blade was ever drawn. He wanted to be feared as much as he wanted to win, understanding on some deep, calculating level that fear itself was a weapon, one that could weaken an opponent's resolve and sharpen their mistakes before the fight even properly began. Clone troopers who served under Jedi generals during these campaigns often described a distinct and unsettling shift in behavior among their commanders whenever intelligence suggested Grievous might be personally present on a battlefield. A heightened tension that even the most composed and battle-hardened Jedi could not entirely conceal. There came a point, roughly midway through the long years of galactic war, when Grievous orchestrated one of the most audacious and calculated ambushes of his entire campaign, a confrontation designed not merely to kill a single Jedi, but to strike directly at the heart of the Order's confidence in numbers as a form of safety, believing, not unreasonably, that a group of Jedi fighting together would present a formidable and perhaps insurmountable challenge even for him. Grievous engineered a situation specifically to prove that assumption false. Several capable Jedi, drawn together by circumstance and mutual trust in each other's combat prowess, found themselves cornered by him in a confrontation that would become one of the most infamous engagements of the entire war. Whispered about afterward, not because Grievous lost, which would have been the expected outcome given the numbers involved, but because of how thoroughly and how efficiently he turned what should have been his greatest vulnerability into another demonstration of exactly how far above ordinary threats he truly stood. He moved between his opponents with a calculated, almost surgical precision, using his four arms not simply to parry more attacks, but to actively divide his opponent's coordination, forcing Jedi, who had trained their entire lives to fight in harmony with a single force-guided rhythm, to instead contend with an opponent whose combat logic followed no rhythm they could predict or synchronize against. Lightsabers clashed in blinding arcs of colored light, the Jedi working together with practiced coordination, calling out warnings, covering each other's openings, executing maneuvers built on years of shared trust. Grievous absorbed it all, adapted to it all, and turned their coordination into a weakness by forcing them to constantly reposition around a threat that seemed to be everywhere within their formation at once. When the dust settled and the fight reached its conclusion, the Jedi who survived did so only through desperate improvisation and no small amount of fortune, while Grievous walked away with new additions to his collection and a reputation that had, if anything, only grown more dreadful in the retelling. It was engagements like this one that transformed Grievous, in the eyes of the wider galaxy and the Jedi Order specifically, from merely a dangerous separatist commander into something closer to a singular personal terror. A figure whose name alone was enough to shift the tenor of a war council meeting or tighten the grip of a clone trooper on his weapon. The Jedi, an order built on centuries of tradition, discipline, and hard-won confidence in their own martial and spiritual mastery, found themselves confronting an uncomfortable truth. There existed, out among the stars, a being who was not a Sith, who commanded no dark side power, who followed no ancient philosophy of the Force at all, and yet who had become one of the single deadliest threats any Jedi could face in personal combat. It was a truth that unsettled masters, who had spent their entire lives believing that mastery of the Force itself was the ultimate ceiling on lethal capability. Grievous had shattered that ceiling through nothing but engineered violence, obsessive study, and the horrifying transformation forced upon him by beings who had never once cared what remained of the person underneath the machine. One of the earliest and most devastating demonstrations of exactly what Grievous had become came during a separatist offensive against a heavily defended world on the fringes of contested space, a battle that would later be studied and restudied by Republic strategists precisely because of how catastrophically it went for the Jedi involved. A contingent of Jedi generals, several of them masters with decades of combat experience behind them, had been dispatched together with a sizable clone force to blunt a separatist advance that intelligence suggested was being personally overseen by Grievous himself. The Jedi command structure at the time still operated under the assumption, reasonable enough given everything the Order had learned about warfare over 1,000 generations, that a coordinated group of experienced Jedi supported by disciplined clone infantry represented an overwhelming tactical advantage against almost any conceivable opponent. Grievous had studied this assumption carefully, and he had built an ambush specifically designed to punish it. The battle began conventionally enough. Droid forces engaging clone lines in the kind of grinding, attritional combat that had already become horribly familiar across 100 fronts of the war. But partway through the engagement, as Republic forces pressed what appeared to be a successful advance, Grievous revealed himself, emerging from concealment with a speed and violence that shattered the Jedi Command Group's cohesion within moments. He did not engage the group as a unit, the way a less experienced fighter might have. Instead, he isolated individual targets with terrifying efficiency, using the chaos of the surrounding droid and clone combat as cover to separate Jedi from their support and from each other, picking his moments with the calculated patience of a hunter who had rehearsed this exact scenario 100 times in his own mind before ever executing it in reality. One Jedi Master, a warrior whose skill with a lightsaber had earned considerable respect within the Order over a long and distinguished career, moved to engage him directly, believing correctly that buying time for the others to regroup was worth the risk to herself. She fought with everything her decades of training had given her, drawing on force-enhanced speed and precision that would have overwhelmed almost any conventional opponent within moments. Grievous absorbed her opening flurry of strikes with a composure that unsettled even the clone troopers watching from a distance. His 4 arms working in a coordination that seemed to mock the very idea that a single opponent, however skilled, could outmaneuver a being built specifically to defeat exactly this kind of attack. The duel that followed was brutal and mercifully brief, ending with her lightsaber added to his growing collection and her name added to a list that the Jedi Council would receive with the particular heavy silence reserved for losses that confirmed their worst fears, rather than merely adding to a growing tally. The rest of the Jedi Command Group, badly outmatched once their cohesion had been broken, fought a desperate and costly retreat, saved ultimately not by any tactical victory, but by the simple fact that Grievous, methodical as ever, chose not to pursue them into terrain that favored their remaining numbers over his advantage in isolated combat. He had achieved what he came for. The battle itself, from a purely strategic standpoint, would later be debated by military historians as a marginal and costly Republic tactical withdrawal rather than a decisive separatist victory. But nobody who studied the engagement afterward cared much about the strategic ledger. What mattered, what spread through every corner of the Jedi Order and the wider Republic military within days, was the confirmation that Grievous could dismantle a coordinated group of experienced Jedi Masters not through droid numbers or superior firepower, but through raw, personal, hand-to-hand lethality that no living swordsman in the galaxy had yet found a reliable answer to. Word of engagements like this one traveled quickly through clone ranks, carried from unit to unit, less as official intelligence and more as the kind of grim folklore that soldiers pass among themselves to prepare each other for horrors that official briefings tend to sanitize. Clone troopers who had never personally encountered Grievous nonetheless learned to recognize the particular tension that settled over their Jedi commanders whenever his name entered a briefing, a tension that experienced troopers came to interpret as more reliable intelligence than almost anything printed in an official report. Some clone battalions developed their own informal protocols for what to do if Grievous appeared on a battlefield, protocols built less on Republic command doctrine and more on hard-won survivor's instinct, passed down from troopers who had lived through encounters that official records tended to describe in far more measured language than the reality had warranted. Separatist propaganda, meanwhile, embraced the growing legend enthusiastically, understanding precisely how valuable a figure like Grievous had become to their cause beyond his purely military value. Holonet broadcasts controlled by separatist-aligned worlds portrayed him as an unstoppable champion of their movement, a being who had single-handedly proven that the Jedi Order's centuries of accumulated mystique could be broken by will, discipline, and sufficient contempt for the institution's self-regard. This portrayal served Dooku's broader political purposes as much as it served Grievous's personal reputation, reinforcing among wavering worlds the idea that the Republic's supposedly invincible protectors could, in fact, be hunted and defeated, that the war was not the foregone conclusion in the Republic's favor, that Coruscant's propaganda machine wanted frightened populations to believe. Within the halls of the Jedi Temple, meanwhile, a quieter and more troubling conversation had begun to take shape among the senior masters, one that rarely reached official records precisely because of how uncomfortable its implications were. Grievous's success against the Order was forcing a reckoning that went beyond simple tactical adjustment. For 1,000 generations, the Jedi had understood their martial mastery as inseparable from their spiritual discipline, the two woven together so completely that most Jedi could not conceive of true swordsmanship existing apart from a living connection to the Force. Grievous shattered that assumption through sheer mechanical brutality, proving that raw physical capability, ruthlessly optimized and endlessly drilled without any spiritual dimension whatsoever, could match and frequently defeat warriors whose entire philosophy held that such a thing should have been impossible. Some masters argued this made him a lesser threat in the long run, a being who could be outthought and outmaneuvered by Jedi, willing to abandon traditional forms and improvise more aggressively. Others argued the opposite, that his complete detachment from the spiritual dimension of combat made him uniquely dangerous precisely because none of the Order's traditional methods for reading an opponent's intentions through the Force applied to a being whose intentions were calculated by processes rather than felt through emotion. Both positions, in their own ways, were correct, and the disagreement itself reflected just how genuinely novel a threat Grievous represented. He forced individual Jedi across the war to confront questions about their own combat philosophy that the Order's traditional training had never adequately prepared them to answer. Younger knights, eager to prove themselves and frustrated by Council directives urging caution around any confirmed Grievous sighting, sometimes chafed against restrictions that felt, to impatient temperaments, like an admission of fear unbefitting a Jedi. A number of these more headstrong knights sought him out directly over the course of the war, driven by confidence in their own abilities, by a desire to end his campaign of terror once and for all, or simply by the battlefield necessity of protecting troops under their command when he appeared with no warning. Grievous met each of these individual challenges with the same patient, methodical brutality he brought to every engagement, and the Order's collection of cautionary tales grew correspondingly longer with each passing month of the war. He was not, however, invincible, and the handful of Jedi who did manage to survive direct personal combat against him, though none in these early years of the war managed to defeat him outright, provided the Order with its first genuinely useful intelligence about how he could eventually be beaten. Those who survived described a pattern worth noting carefully. Grievous fought with supreme confidence bordering on arrogance, a trait that made sense given how thoroughly his combat record justified that confidence, but which also meant he rarely adapted his approach mid-fight. When an opponent did something genuinely unexpected, he relied heavily on the sheer number of blades he could bring to bear simultaneously and on cybernetic reflexes that outpaced almost any organic response. But survivors noted that his movements, for all their speed, followed patterns that a sufficiently perceptive and unconventional opponent could, in theory, learn to anticipate. This intelligence, gathered slowly and at tremendous cost across dozens of engagements, would eventually prove crucial. though its usefulness lay years ahead still, in confrontations that had not yet come to pass. Perhaps the cruelest aspect of Grievous's growing legend, and the aspect that the Jedi Order found most difficult to process even privately among themselves, was how effectively his campaign exploited the very ideals the Order held most sacred. Jedi were trained from earliest childhood to place the protection of others above their own safety, to answer calls for help without hesitation regardless of personal risk, to trust in the strength of numbers and coordinated action when facing threats too large for any single Jedi to handle alone. Grievous understood these ideals intimately, not through any philosophical study of the Jedi Order, but through cold, practical observation of how Jedi consistently behaved in crisis situations. And he built his entire hunting strategy around turning those noble instincts into exploitable weaknesses. He targeted rescue missions specifically, understanding that Jedi would answer distress calls with predictable urgency. He targeted diplomatic escorts, understanding that Jedi assigned to protect civilians would not abandon their charges even when tactical logic suggested retreat. He targeted, above all, the moments when Jedi felt most confident in numbers, understanding that confidence itself could be turned into a weapon against them if the numbers involved could be isolated and picked apart one at a time. This pattern did not go unnoticed forever. As reports accumulated and the Jedi Council's understanding of his methods deepened, more sophisticated countermeasures began to take shape. Contingency protocols, specifically designed around denying him the isolated engagements he depended on, and intelligence networks dedicated to tracking his movements with enough advance warning that Jedi generals in contested sectors could adjust their deployments accordingly. These measures reduced, though they never eliminated, the frequency of his most devastating ambushes. Grievous, ever adaptive within the narrow confines of his combat-focused mind, responded by growing bolder rather than more cautious, shifting his focus increasingly toward high-value targets whose deaths would carry the greatest psychological and strategic weight, rather than simply accumulating trophies from whatever Jedi happened to cross his path. It was during this escalating phase of the war, as his reputation transformed from battlefield rumor into a matter of formal, galaxy-wide strategic concern, that Grievous began attracting the direct and personal attention of individuals whose own roles in the unfolding conflict would eventually intersect with his in ways that neither he nor almost anyone else in the galaxy could yet foresee. Reports of his growing collection reached even the highest levels of the Republic's military and political leadership, discussed in hushed briefings, alongside far larger strategic concerns about the war's overall trajectory. And within the Jedi Temple itself, certain masters, watching the mounting toll of names lost to his blades, began to privately wonder whether Grievous represented not merely a dangerous battlefield commander to be managed through tactics and caution, but something closer to a signal, a warning sign of exactly how far their enemies were willing to go, and exactly what kind of galaxy might be waiting for them once this terrible war finally reached its conclusion. And this, perhaps, was the deepest and cruelest irony buried at the center of the entire nightmare. Grievous had become the most feared Jedi killer in galactic history, not because he chose that path from ambition or malice in the way a Sith Lord might, but because a grieving, broken war hero, robbed of his wife, his body, and his home, in a single orchestrated act of sabotage, had been rebuilt by unseen hands into a weapon and pointed with surgical precision at the very institution that his manipulators found most convenient to blame. Every lightsaber added to his collection was, in some twisted sense, both a genuine act of hatred born from real and terrible loss, and simultaneously the calculated fulfillment of Count Dooku's original design, a design that had never truly been about avenging Kaylee or striking back at institutional injustice at all, but about creating the perfect instrument of terror to serve a war that had been planned by a hidden Sith Lord long before Kimenjai Shilal's shuttle ever fell burning from Kaylee's skies. His reputation, by this stage of the war, had spread far beyond the Jedi Order and the upper echelons of Republic military command. Ordinary citizens across 100 worlds had heard some version of his legend, distorted and exaggerated with each retelling, until Grievous existed in the public imagination less as a separatist general and more as something closer to a monster from an old story, a mechanical beast who hunted the Republic's most sacred protectors and wore their weapons as jewelry. Holonet reports on his campaigns were carefully managed by Republic propaganda officers who understood how dangerous unchecked panic about him could become. But managing official reports did nothing to stop the whispers, the rumors, the campfire stories told by clone troopers who had survived encounters with him and carried the memory of that survival like a scar they would never fully explain to anyone who hadn't been there. Within the Jedi Temple itself, his name had become something spoken carefully, almost ritually. Among masters discussing strategy, a name that carried weight far beyond what a simple separatist commander should have warranted. Younger Padawans, trained from childhood to believe that a Jedi's connection to the Force made them fundamentally more capable than nearly any threat the galaxy could produce, found themselves confronting the uncomfortable reality of his existence as part of their combat education, studying his known tactics and confirmed engagements, the way a soldier studies a rival army's doctrine. He had become, in every meaningful sense, a curriculum unto himself, a singular threat, significant enough to warrant dedicated study by an order that had spent 1,000 generations cataloging threats to the galaxy's peace. Grievous did not operate in isolation, and his relationships with the other prominent figures of the separatist leadership revealed almost as much about his character as his battlefield conduct did. With Count Dooku, the relationship remained one of student and master, though it carried none of the philosophical warmth that Dooku's own teacher, hidden behind the identity of a humble chancellor's advisor, cultivated with his other apprentices. Dooku valued Grievous as an instrument, a supremely capable general who could be trusted to execute military strategy with ruthless efficiency, but he never fully trusted him the way he trusted beings who shared his aristocratic vision for the galaxy's future. Grievous, for his part, respected Dooku's tactical mind and owed him. However, he understood that debt privately, the very existence he now carried, but he harbored no illusions about the relationship being one of equals. He served because serving gave him access to an endless supply of Jedi to hunt, and because open defiance of Dooku would have meant defiance of forces even more dangerous than Dooku himself. Forces Grievous only partially understood existed at all during much of the war. His relationship with other separatist military and political figures was considerably more strained. Newt Gunray and the Trade Federation leadership found him useful but deeply unsettling. A general whose battlefield brilliance they depended upon, but whose casual, almost recreational brutality toward captured enemies and defeated worlds made even hardened corporate warlords uneasy in his presence. San Hill and the Techno-Union, who had, after all, overseen his physical reconstruction, and therefore understood better than almost anyone exactly what he had once been and exactly what had been done to him, treated him with a wary, clinical detachment. The kind of caution one might extend toward a highly successful experiment that had perhaps succeeded a little too well. Poggle the Lesser and the Geonosian foundries that continued to supply and maintain his droid armies dealt with him primarily through intermediaries, having learned early that direct dealings with Grievous carried an unpredictable edge of danger that made careful subordinates infinitely preferable to direct negotiation. Asajj Ventress, the fearsome Sith-trained assassin, who had served for a time as one of Dooku's other prized instruments against the Jedi, represented perhaps the most complicated of these relationships. The two shared an obsession, in their very different ways, with killing Jedi and with proving their own indispensable value to Dooku's cause. And this shared obsession bred a rivalry that neither ever spoke of openly, but that shaped their interactions whenever their paths crossed during joint operations. Ventress, trained in the ways of the Force and capable of drawing on the dark side in combat, privately regarded Grievous's mechanical brutality as a crude substitute for genuine mastery, a brute force solution to a problem that true Force sensitivity solved far more elegantly. Grievous, in turn, viewed Ventress's reliance on the Force as an unnecessary crutch, evidence that even Dooku's most trusted Force-wielding agent still needed abilities he himself had learned to render irrelevant through pure calculated skill. Their mutual contempt, held carefully in check by their shared loyalty to Dooku and the larger separatist cause, occasionally simmered close enough to the surface during joint campaigns that subordinates on both sides learned to recognize the particular tension that settled over command briefings whenever the two were required to coordinate. Directly beneath all of these relationships, carefully hidden and rarely acknowledged even to himself, Grievous carried a paranoia that grew steadily more pronounced as the war dragged on. He understood, on some level, that his rebuilt mind rarely allowed him to examine too closely, that he was not truly an equal partner in the separatist cause, but a weapon that had been forged for a specific purpose, and that could, in theory, be discarded or replaced the moment that purpose was fulfilled or a more efficient alternative presented itself. This understanding manifested itself in behaviors that those closest to him noted with quiet concern. He grew increasingly protective of his chestplate and the vulnerable organic components housed within it, going to elaborate lengths to ensure that knowledge of this specific weakness remained confined to the smallest possible circle of trusted engineers and medical droids. He grew increasingly obsessive about his lightsaber collection, treating it not merely as a trophy display but as a kind of ledger, tangible proof of his own continued value and lethality that no amount of political maneuvering by rivals within the separatist leadership could erase or diminish. And he grew, in ways that few around him fully appreciated at the time, increasingly convinced that his true purpose in the unfolding war extended beyond simply serving as Dooku's supreme commander, that some larger design awaited him, one that would eventually require him to prove his value, not merely against ordinary Jedi Knights, scattered across contested worlds, but against targets and stakes far greater than anything he had yet faced. This growing sense of destiny, however distorted and however manipulated by forces he still did not fully comprehend, would soon be tested in ways that would push his campaign of terror to its absolute peak. drawing him toward confrontations that would cement his reputation as the single most feared enemy the Jedi Order had ever faced in personal combat. And that would set in motion the final, terrible chain of events that would eventually determine whether the monster built from a grieving Kaleesh war hero's shattered body would live to see the galaxy he had helped burn, or whether the war he had served so faithfully would finally turn, as wars built on lies and manipulation so often do, to consume the very weapon it had created. And yet, for all his terrible reputation, for all the fear his name carried across every corner of Republic and Separatist space alike, Grievous remained fundamentally what he had always been since the moment Dooku first visited his broken and reconstructed body. A tool. A magnificent, terrifying, and genuinely lethal tool. But a tool nonetheless, wielded by architects far more patient and far more dangerous than even he understood. Somewhere behind Dooku, behind the entire Separatist movement, behind the war itself, moved a design so vast and so carefully hidden that even the most feared Jedi killer in galactic history was, in the end, only ever a piece being played toward an outcome he could not see and would never fully understand until the very final days of his existence, when the war that had consumed his rebuilt life would finally turn to consume him in turn. By the war's midpoint, the Jedi Order had compiled what amounted to an entire internal doctrine built around the singular problem he represented. A doctrine born out of grief and repetition, refined engagement by engagement, loss by loss, until it had become as much a part of standard Jedi military training as anything drawn from the Order's ancient teachings. Reports of his campaigns filled entire archives back at the temple, catalogued and cross-referenced by analysts, trying desperately to find the pattern that would finally give the Order a decisive advantage. Some of these analysts began to notice something curious buried within the data, a subtle but consistent correlation between the intensity and frequency of his personal appearances on the battlefield and the broader strategic movements of the war itself, as though his hunts, however driven by personal obsession they appeared on the surface, were also being directed, timed, and deployed according to a rhythm that served purposes far beyond his own satisfaction. It was a troubling thought, one that few dared voice aloud even among trusted colleagues, the possibility that even Grievous's monstrous individual campaign of terror against the Jedi Order was itself merely one carefully calibrated instrument within an orchestration too vast for any single Jedi, however wise, to fully perceive. The clone troopers who served alongside Jedi generals throughout these years carried their own private reckoning with his legend, one built less on strategic analysis and more on the accumulated weight of memory. Veteran troopers who had survived multiple campaigns without ever personally encountering him nonetheless spoke of him the way sailors on ancient seas once spoke of storms too large to be reasoned with, an inevitability to be endured rather than a threat to be calculated against. Newer recruits, hearing these stories second-hand in barracks and staging areas before their first deployments, absorbed the fear along with the tactics, carrying it with them into engagements where the mere possibility of his presence altered how carefully they watched the tree line, how quickly they moved between cover, how tightly they stayed near their Jedi commander, rather than trusting entirely in droid suppression fire to keep them safe. And still, through all of it, through every battle won and every Jedi lost, through every trophy added to a collection that had grown so large it required specialized compartments simply to house it all, Grievous remained convinced. in whatever passed for his private convictions after everything that had been stripped from him and replaced, that he alone had chosen this path, that his hatred for the Jedi Order was entirely his own, forged in the wreckage of a shuttle that had fallen from Kaylee's skies, and in the grief of losing a wife who had loved him before anyone had ever thought to rebuild him into something else. He did not yet understand, and would not fully understand until circumstances forced the truth upon him in the war's final and most catastrophic days, exactly how much of that conviction had been carefully planted rather than genuinely grown, how much of his fury had been cultivated rather than earned, and how completely the architects of the war he served had succeeded in turning a broken war hero's private tragedy into the single most effective instrument of terror the Jedi Order had faced in 1,000 generations of guarding the galaxy's peace. The war, however, was not yet finished with him, and neither was the plan that had built him in the first place. Ahead lay campaigns that would push his reputation past even its current terrible heights, a direct role in one of the most audacious operations of the entire conflict, and finally, a reckoning on a scorched and windswept world that would determine, once and for all, whether the most feared Jedi killer in galactic history would be remembered as an unstoppable monster, or as the tragic final proof of exactly how far those who built him were willing to go to win a war they had started through lies from its very first day. For now, though, the hunt continued, blade by blade, world by world, and across the Jedi Temple's ancient halls, more names were added to a list no one wanted to keep growing, a list that would not stop growing until the war itself finally reached its terrible, long-planned conclusion. The war's final and most audacious chapter for Grievous began not on some distant battlefield, but at the very heart of the Republic itself, in the skies above Coruscant, the capital world whose orbit had never once, in the entire history of the Republic, been breached by an enemy fleet. Dooku and the hidden architect standing behind him had been planning this operation for a long time, waiting for precisely the right convergence of circumstances, and when that convergence finally arrived, it was Grievous who was chosen to lead it. A decision that spoke volumes about exactly how much confidence the Separatist leadership placed in his particular blend of ruthlessness and precision. The objective was staggering in its audacity. Grievous would personally command a fleet action against Coruscant's defenses, breach the planet's orbital shielding, and extract the single most valuable hostage in the entire galaxy, the Supreme Chancellor of the Republic himself. The assault began with a devastating opening strike. Separatist warships dropping out of hyperspace in staggered waves, designed to overwhelm Coruscant's defense grid before a coordinated response could be mounted. Republic cruisers scrambled into formation as alarms tore through every level of the planet's command infrastructure. And for the first time in living memory, the citizens of the Republic's shining capital world looked up into their own sky and saw the unmistakable signature of open war burning across the atmosphere above them. The scale of the engagement dwarfed almost everything that had come before it in the war. Hundreds of capital ships converged in the space above Coruscant within hours, turbolaser fire, lighting the upper atmosphere in colors that civilians on the surface would describe for years afterward as something closer to an aurora than a battle, beautiful and horrifying in equal measure. Republic cruisers, caught partially unprepared despite years of war that should have hardened every defensive contingency imaginable, scrambled fighter wings and mobilized planetary shield generators, even as the first waves of Separatist boarding craft began threading through gaps in the chaotic engagement, seeking paths toward the surface, that the confusion of full-scale fleet combat made possible in ways that a more measured, conventional assault never could have achieved. Grievous moved through this chaos with the same cold, calculating patience he brought to every ground assault, directing his forces not towards simple destruction, but toward a specific, narrow objective, a corridor of approach that would let his own vessels slip through the confusion toward the Republic's seat of government, while the bulk of both fleets tore each other apart in the space around them. He had planned this approach meticulously in the weeks leading up to the operation, studying Coruscant's defensive protocols with the same obsessive attention to detail he had once applied to studying individual Jedi fighting styles, understanding that the difference between a legendary tactical triumph and a catastrophic, war-ending failure would come down to margins of seconds and precisely which corridor of the battle his flagship threaded through at exactly the right moment. His own vessel, a heavily modified warship bristling with weaponry and shielding well beyond what a standard command cruiser would carry, absorbed considerable damage during the approach, taking direct hits from Republic point defense batteries that would have crippled a lesser ship entirely. Grievous remained on the bridge throughout, directing subordinate officers with the same unnerving calm he displayed in melee combat, treating the chaos of a capital ship engagement as merely another kind of battlefield to be read, understood, and exploited, rather than a source of the kind of fear that gripped even veteran officers around him, as hull breaches tore through lower decks and casualty reports mounted with sickening speed. Descending toward the Chancellor's private tower under cover of the largest battle Coruscant skies had ever witnessed, Grievous led a boarding action directly into the heart of Republic political power, cutting through security forces with the same brutal efficiency he had spent years perfecting against Jedi in the field. Republic security details, trained and equipped to handle political threats and isolated criminal incidents, rather than a full military incursion led personally by the war's most feared enemy commander, found themselves overwhelmed within minutes despite fighting with genuine desperate courage. Grievous himself led the final push toward the Chancellor's private chambers, cutting down resistance with a methodical efficiency that left surviving witnesses describing the encounter afterward less as combat and more as an unstoppable natural disaster moving through a building that had never once, in the entire history of the Republic, been designed to withstand this kind of direct assault. When Jedi generals arrived to intervene, drawn back from their own commands elsewhere in the fleet battle, specifically because intelligence had identified Grievous's personal involvement in the operation, he did not flee the confrontation the way a purely tactical commander focused solely on the extraction might have. He engaged them directly, adding to his reputation even in the middle of the single most important operation of his entire career, before ultimately withdrawing with his prize secured, the Chancellor of the Republic himself, now a captive aboard his own flagship. It was, by any measure, the single greatest tactical humiliation the Republic had suffered in the entire war, and Grievous had been the one to deliver it personally, cementing his legend not merely as a hunter of individual Jedi scattered across the galaxy's edges, but as a commander capable of striking directly at the beating heart of civilization itself. The operation, however, carried within it the seeds of a betrayal that Grievous would not live long enough to fully process, though its shape would soon become horrifyingly clear. What he did not know What almost no one outside the innermost circle of the true architect's confidence knew was that the Chancellor he had just captured was not merely a valuable hostage to be leveraged for political concessions, but the very Sith Lord who had orchestrated the entire war from its beginning, the same hidden power who had guided Dooku, who had guided the sabotage of Grievous's own shuttle years before, who had, in ways Grievous could not yet fully see, guided every step of the tragedy that had transformed a grieving Kaleesh war hero into the galaxy's most feared Jedi killer in the first place. The Chancellor's rescue, when it came, was accomplished by two Jedi who boarded the flagship in pursuit, and though Grievous engaged them briefly before withdrawing to preserve his own forces amid the ship's catastrophic damage, the true purpose of the entire operation had never actually been the capture itself. It had been the culmination of a plan whose final phase was only just beginning, one that would require Grievous, and every other piece still remaining on the board, to be moved into position for an ending that had been designed years before any of them understood what game they were truly playing. In the aftermath of the Coruscant operation, as the war entered its final and most chaotic phase, Grievous withdrew his remaining forces to consolidate on a remote world called Utapau, a planet of vast sinkholes and hidden cave cities that offered both strategic concealment and a natural fortress from which to direct the separatist war effort's final movements. It was here, in the depths of these ancient sinkhole settlements, among a native population that had watched his droid forces occupy their world with a mixture of fear and grim resignation, that Grievous would make his final stand, though he did not yet know it, as he settled into command of what he still believed was merely a temporary staging ground for the war's continuation rather than its ending. The choice of Utapau reflected the same tactical instincts that had defined his entire military career. The planet's vast network of sinkholes, some of them large enough to swallow entire cities within their walls, offered natural concealment from orbital detection that few other worlds in the galaxy could match, while the labyrinthine cave systems threading beneath the surface provided both defensible choke points and rapid escape routes should the position ever be compromised. Grievous had studied the planet's unique geography carefully before selecting it, understanding that a fortress built from natural terrain, properly fortified and defended, could prove far more resilient than any purely artificial stronghold that Republic intelligence might more easily locate and target. The occupation of Utapau was, by Grievous's standards, almost restrained. He stationed droid forces throughout the sinkhole cities, maintained strict control over the native Pauan and Utai populations, and used the planet's natural cave systems to shelter what remained of his personal command staff, and a portion of the Separatist Council itself, several of whom had been relocated there under his protection as the war's tide continued, shifting in ways that grew increasingly difficult even for Dooku's carefully laid plans to fully control. The native population endured the occupation with a wary, careful compliance, understanding that open resistance against droid forces commanded by the galaxy's most feared military mind offered little realistic hope of success, while quietly, cautiously, preserving whatever fragments of information about troop movements and defensive positions might one day prove useful to anyone willing and able to challenge the occupation directly. Local leaders among the Pauan Council maintained a careful, outward cooperation with the occupying forces even as they quietly monitored every shift in droid deployment, patient in a way that mirrored, in its own smaller fashion, the same kind of long, careful waiting. that had characterized so much of the war's hidden machinery from its very beginning. Grievous spent this period much as he had spent every relatively quiet interlude throughout the war, maintaining his combat readiness through relentless drilling, tending to his lightsaber collection, and monitoring reports from the war's other fronts with the same cold, patient attentiveness that had made him such an effective hunter from the very beginning of the conflict. He reviewed dispatches from separatist commanders across dozens of remaining fronts, adjusted supply allocations, and maintained the same exacting standards of readiness among his droid forces that had characterized his command throughout the entire war, even as reports filtering in from elsewhere in the galaxy grew increasingly fragmented and contradictory. A subtle but growing sign that the larger war machine he served was beginning, in ways he could not yet fully perceive, to come apart at its foundations. He did not know that the war itself was, by this point, entering its final hours, rather than merely another extended lull. He did not know that Dooku had already been killed, cut down in a duel aboard the very flagship from which Grievous had orchestrated the Chancellor's capture, struck down not by the Chancellor's rescuers acting on their own initiative, but at the Chancellor's own quiet, chilling encouragement, a detail that would have told Grievous everything he needed to know about the true nature of the war he had served, had he ever learned it. News of Dooku's death, when it finally reached him through the fragmented, increasingly unreliable command channels still connecting Utapau to the wider separatist war effort, arrived with a strange, hollow quality that unsettled even Grievous's usually unshakable composure. Dooku had, whatever the limits of their relationship, represented the closest thing to a mentor and patron that Grievous had known since his transformation, the architect of the training and philosophy that had turned a broken war hero into the galaxy's most feared individual threat. His sudden death, reported without meaningful detail or explanation through channels that seemed, in retrospect, oddly incurious about investigating the full circumstances of his fall, left Grievous facing a war whose true command structure had suddenly, inexplicably, become far less clear than it had been only days before. With Dooku gone, Grievous found himself elevated, at least in name, to the position of overall supreme commander of the entire separatist war effort, a promotion that under any other circumstances might have represented the pinnacle of everything Dooku's training had built him toward. The separatist council members sheltering under his protection on Utapau received the news with visible unease rather than celebration, understanding perhaps better than Grievous himself did that. A war whose two most senior military and political architects, the hidden Sith Lord's true position notwithstanding, had both fallen in such rapid succession, was a war whose foundations had grown considerably more precarious than official separatist propaganda, continued to suggest to worlds still fighting and dying under the Confederacy's banner. Grievous, for his part, accepted the elevated command with the same cold, methodical professionalism he brought to every other aspect of his role, issuing directives to remaining separatist forces across dozens of fronts and reorganizing what remained of the war's command structure around his own authority, never once suspecting that the promotion itself had been arranged, in ways he could not perceive, to position him precisely where his true master wanted him when the war's final, catastrophic phase finally began in earnest. He spent his final days as Supreme Commander much as he had spent every other day of the war, reviewing tactical reports, drilling with his blades in the quiet hours between command duties, and running a gloved, mechanical hand across the collection of lightsabers he had spent years assembling, never once suspecting that the war he had served so faithfully and the grief that had first set him upon its path so many years before had both been engineered from their very first moments by a single patient architect who had already decided, long before Grievous ever set foot on Utapau, exactly how and when his usefulness would come to its end. Instead, it arrived at precisely the moment when the war he now nominally led had already been decided by forces operating several layers above anything Grievous could see or influence. The council members who had once looked to Dooku, and increasingly to Grievous himself, for direction and reassurance about the war's ultimate trajectory, found themselves, in these final weeks, growing steadily more anxious about the absence of clear, strategic guidance from the wider separatist leadership, an anxiety that Grievous, focused as ever on the immediate tactical demands of defending his fortress and maintaining his forces' readiness, did not fully register as the ominous signal it actually represented. The Jedi Order, meanwhile, had spent considerable resources over recent months attempting to pinpoint exactly where Grievous had relocated his command, understanding correctly that ending the war decisively would require not merely defeating separatist fleets in open battle, but eliminating the singular military mind whose tactical brilliance had kept the Confederacy's war machine functioning even as its political leadership grew increasingly desperate and fractured. Intelligence gathered from captured separatist communications, cross-referenced against patterns of supply movement and fleet activity across the war's final months, gradually narrowed the search until Utapau emerged as the most probable location of his final stronghold. The Jedi Council made a decision that reflected exactly how seriously they still regarded him even in the war's closing days, dispatching one of their most capable and experienced generals specifically to hunt him down and end his campaign of terror once and for all. Obi-Wan Kenobi arrived at Utapau alone, a decision that might have seemed reckless, given everything the Jedi Order had learned over years of costly engagements against Grievous, but which reflected a deliberate strategic calculation built on hard-won intelligence about exactly how Grievous operated. A larger force would have alerted separatist defenses immediately and given Grievous every opportunity to flee before engagement could even be forced, preserving his life and his usefulness to whatever remained of the separatist cause. A single Jedi, moving carefully and relying on stealth and local cooperation rather than overwhelming force, stood a far better chance of getting close enough to end the confrontation before Grievous could simply retreat into hiding once again, as he had done so many times before across the length of the war. The journey to Utapau itself carried a certain grim symbolism that would not have been lost on anyone familiar with the full arc of the war's final campaigns. Kenobi traveled alone into what Republic intelligence had identified, with cautious but growing confidence, as the last significant stronghold of organized separatist military command, understanding that whatever awaited him in those sinkhole cities represented, in a very real sense, the final concentrated remnant of everything the war had cost the galaxy across its years of grinding conflict. He carried with him not merely his own considerable skill and experience, honed across dozens of campaigns against separatist forces throughout the war, but the accumulated weight of Republic intelligence gathered at tremendous cost over years of Jedi losses to precisely the enemy he now hunted. Kenobi's approach to Utapau relied heavily on cooperation from the planet's native population, whose resentment toward the harsh separatist occupation made them willing, if cautious, allies in identifying the locations of droid patrols and the general layout of the sinkhole cities where Grievous had established his headquarters. Local guides. Moving through tunnels and passages, the generations of Utaporn engineering had carved into the sinkhole walls long before any droid army had ever occupied their world. Led Kenobi through routes that avoided the heaviest concentrations of separatist patrols, trading whispered directions and careful warnings for the promise, however uncertain given the ongoing chaos of the war, that Republic forces might soon lift the occupation that had settled over their world like a shadow. Moving through the settlement with careful patience, gathering information and avoiding direct confrontation wherever possible, Kenobi eventually confirmed Grievous's presence within one of the deepest sinkhole cities, a discovery that set in motion the final confrontation both the galaxy and, in a sense, the entire arc of Grievous's transformed existence had been building toward since the moment a shuttle exploded in the skies above Kaylee years before. The confirmation came through careful observation rather than direct engagement, Kenobi watching from concealed vantage points as droid patrol patterns and command traffic gradually revealed the unmistakable signature of a headquarters commanded by someone whose obsessive attention to defensive discipline matched everything Republic intelligence had catalogued about Grievous's command style over years of war. Grievous, for his part, was not caught entirely unaware. His command structure, however diminished by the war's mounting losses, still maintained enough vigilance to detect the growing signs of infiltration within Utapau's settlements, and by the time Kenobi finally moved to confront him directly, Grievous had already begun making preparations of his own, understanding on some level that the quiet interlude he had been enjoying was drawing rapidly to a close. When the two finally came face to face, in a confrontation that would become one of the most consequential single combats of the entire war, neither seemed particularly surprised to find the other exactly where they stood. The duel that followed unfolded across the vertiginous, wind-scoured platforms and walkways of Utapau's sinkhole city, a setting whose sheer scale and dizzying verticality seemed almost designed by fate itself to match the enormity of what this particular confrontation represented. Grievous met Kenobi's initial attack with the same overwhelming confidence that had defined every previous engagement of his long and terrible career, wielding multiple blades with the practiced, mechanical fluidity that had ended so many Jedi lives before this one. Kenobi, however, brought to this fight something that many of Grievous's previous opponents had lacked: a deep, hard-won familiarity with exactly the kind of intelligence the Jedi Order had spent years painstakingly gathering about his fighting patterns, his over-reliance on multiple simultaneous blades, and the specific rhythms of aggression that had proven so devastating against less prepared opponents, but that a sufficiently forewarned and disciplined swordsman could learn to read and counter. The two combatants traded blows across narrow walkways suspended over drops that stretched down into darkness far below, Grievous pressing forward with relentless aggression while Kenobi retreated in careful, calculated stages, never quite giving ground faster than necessary, never quite allowing the retreat to become a rout. Droid forces loyal to Grievous's command occasionally interceded from the periphery, adding rifle fire and mechanized reinforcements to the chaos, only for Kenobi to weave through these interruptions with the kind of improvisational resourcefulness that had defined his own long and distinguished career throughout the war. At several points during the escalating confrontation, the fight spilled from narrow walkways onto wider platforms and back again, each shift in terrain forcing both combatants to adjust their approach, Grievous exploiting open ground to bring more of his 4 blades to bear simultaneously. Kenobi exploiting narrow choke points to reduce the number of angles he needed to defend at once. The fight ranged across multiple levels of the Sinkhole City, Grievous pressing his usual relentless, multi-bladed assault, while Kenobi fought a careful, patient defense, conserving his strength and watching for the openings that his years of study and hard experience told him would eventually present themselves. Grievous, for his part, grew visibly more agitated as the confrontation stretched longer than most of his previous engagements against individual Jedi, unaccustomed to facing an opponent who refused to be rattled by the sheer, overwhelming aggression that had ended so many previous fights within moments of their beginning. Where lesser opponents had panicked or overcommitted in the face of his relentless multi-bladed assault, Kenobi maintained a discipline that denied Grievous the exact kind of opening he had learned, across years of war, to expect and exploit almost reflexively. At one point, during the escalating chaos of the confrontation, Grievous discarded his lightsabers entirely in favor of a blaster pistol, a decision that reflected both his supreme tactical adaptability and a certain contemptuous confidence that any advantage, however unconventional or seemingly dishonorable by traditional dueling standards, was simply another tool to be used without hesitation against an enemy. He still fundamentally believed himself capable of defeating through sheer accumulated skill and ruthless pragmatism. It was a philosophy that had served him extraordinarily well across the entire length of the war. On Utapau, against an opponent who had spent considerable time specifically preparing for this exact eventuality, it would not be enough. The final exchange came swiftly once Kenobi finally found the opening he had been patiently waiting for throughout the entire engagement. Where countless Jedi before him had died attempting to match Grievous blade for blade across a prolonged, grinding confrontation, Kenobi instead exploited precisely the vulnerability that Grievous had spent years so carefully protecting. The exposed organic components housed within his chest plate, the last fragile remnant of the war hero named Kimain Jai Shilal, that had somehow survived every reconstruction, every upgrade, every accumulated layer of durasteel and mechanical enhancement that had been built up around it. A precisely aimed strike found that vulnerability at last. And for the first time in the entire war, the most feared Jedi killer in galactic history found himself facing not another confident opponent to be outmaneuvered and eliminated, but the sudden, irreversible reality of his own mortality, laid bare after years of believing himself to have transcended it entirely through pure mechanical reconstruction. There was, in this final moment, a strange and terrible symmetry with the very beginning of his transformed existence, a symmetry that Grievous himself, in whatever remained of his capacity for reflection in these last seconds, may or may not have fully recognized. He had been made through violence done to a vulnerable, fragile core of organic life, remade by hands that cared nothing for what that core had once been or what it might still become. And now, after years of hunting and killing in the name of a grievance whose true architects he had never once managed to identify, he was unmade through violence delivered to that same vulnerable core, the last surviving fragment of Kimain Jai Shilal, finally extinguished by a blow he had spent years of careful, obsessive preparation trying to ensure could never land. What followed was neither prolonged nor merciful in any traditional sense, though it was not without its own strange, terrible dignity. The vulnerable organic core that had powered his considerable strength and reflexes throughout the entire war finally failed, and the elaborate mechanical architecture built around it, deprived of what remained of the living being it had been constructed to house and protect, began to break down in catastrophic, irreversible fashion. Sparks and mechanical failures cascaded through his frame as backup systems, never designed to sustain his body without the organic core they had always depended upon, struggled and failed in turn. Grievous, coughing violently in what had become, across the length of the war, an almost signature expression of the fragile organic remnant still trapped somewhere within all that armor and machinery, collapsed as the last vestiges of the life that had begun on Kali so many years before, finally, definitively ended. The lightsaber collection that had defined so much of his terrible legend, the trophies representing every Jedi he had hunted and killed across the length of an entire war, lay scattered around a body that had, in the truest and most literal sense, never really belonged to him in the first place, having been built by others for purposes that were never fully his own, in service of a war whose true architect he had never once managed to identify. Kenobi, standing amid the wreckage of the confrontation, took a moment before withdrawing from the sinkhole city, understanding perhaps better than almost anyone else in the galaxy exactly how much tragedy and manipulation had culminated in the scene before him. A being who had once been a devoted husband and decorated war hero, reduced by the deliberate design of others to a scattered collection of trophies and broken machinery at the bottom of a windswept sinkhole on a world far from the green mountains of Kali, where his story had actually begun. Within the Jedi Temple itself, in the brief window between confirmation of his death and the catastrophic events that would follow only days later, a handful of senior masters took time to review, formally, and, for perhaps the final time, the full accounting of what his campaign had cost the Order across the length of the entire war. Analysts who had spent years compiling reports on his tactics, his movements, and his confirmed engagements found themselves closing files that had grown across years of grinding conflict into some of the thickest and most carefully maintained records in the Temple's considerable archives. Some among these analysts noted, with a kind of weary, professional satisfaction that offered little genuine comfort given everything the accounting represented, that the tactical adaptations painstakingly developed over years of costly engagements against him, the revised combat doctrines, the specific countermeasures built around his known patterns and vulnerabilities, had ultimately proven their worth in the confrontation that ended him. A small, cold vindication of everything the Order had learned at such devastating cost across the length of the war. Other masters, less inclined toward tactical satisfaction and more attuned to the deeper currents of loss the war had inflicted upon their Order, found themselves reflecting instead on the sheer scale of what his campaign had actually meant across its full duration, not merely as a list of names and casualty figures, but as a rupture in the Order's own sense of itself. For 1,000 generations, the Jedi had understood themselves as the galaxy's foremost guardians of peace, their mastery of the Force and the lightsaber essentially unchallenged by any threat outside the Sith themselves. Grievous had forced an entire generation of Jedi to confront the uncomfortable possibility that this self-understanding had never been as secure as tradition suggested, that a sufficiently determined and sufficiently resourced enemy could build, through purely mechanical means, a threat capable of matching and frequently defeating even their most experienced warriors. That lesson, however grimly earned, would have shaped Jedi combat doctrine and philosophy for generations to come, had the Order itself been given the chance to survive long enough to fully absorb and apply it. It was not given that chance. Whatever wisdom the Order might have drawn from its long, costly war against Grievous, whatever doctrinal evolution his campaign of terror might eventually have produced within an institution built to learn slowly and carefully across centuries, rather than react hastily in moments of crisis, was rendered largely moot within days of his death, when the war's true, final betrayal swept across the galaxy and left almost no one remaining who might have carried that hard-won wisdom forward into whatever future the Jedi Order might otherwise have built for itself. Among the clone troopers who had spent years fighting under Jedi command specifically because of the threat Grievous represented, news of his death arrived through the same fractured, rapidly spreading channels that had once carried whispered warnings about his presence on distant battlefields. For troopers who had lost brothers to his blades, who had watched Jedi generals they respected fall in engagements against him, the confirmation of his death landed with a complicated mixture of grim satisfaction and lingering unease, the particular unease of soldiers who had spent so long organizing their tactical thinking around a single dominant threat that its sudden absence left an unfamiliar void rather than simple, uncomplicated relief. Veteran troopers who had survived multiple close encounters with him found themselves, in the days following confirmation of his death, telling and retelling stories about those encounters with a new kind of finality, understanding that whatever fear his name had carried through their ranks throughout the war had finally, definitively, come to its end. That relief, however, proved agonizingly brief. Within days of Grievous's death on Utapau, the true, monstrous shape of the entire war finally revealed itself in full. When the very Chancellor Grievous had once personally captured above Coruscant revealed himself as the hidden Sith Lord who had orchestrated the entire conflict from its very first spark, and when an order was given across the length and breadth of the galaxy that turned the loyal clone soldiers who had fought and bled beside Jedi generals throughout the entire war into their sudden, silent executioners, the same troopers who had spent years fighting to protect Jedi generals from threats like Grievous now turned their weapons in a matter of hours and without warning against the very commanders they had served alongside through years of shared hardship, following a hidden biological directive embedded within their conditioning that none of them had ever known existed until the moment it activated and rewrote everything they understood about their own loyalty in an instant. Grievous did not live to see this final betrayal fully unfold, did not live to learn that the Jedi Order he had spent years hunting with such singular, personal focus was, in these same catastrophic days, being annihilated wholesale by an entirely different mechanism, one that made his own years of individual, painstaking hunts look almost artisanal by comparison. There is a particular, bitter irony buried in this timing that few who study the war's final days ever fully sit with. The single most feared individual hunter of Jedi in the galaxy's recent history died mere days before the true architect of the entire war revealed a method of annihilation so total, so instantaneous, and so thoroughly betraying every bond of trust the war had built between clone and Jedi, that Grievous's entire terrible legacy, years of patient hunting, hundreds of confirmed kills, an entire collection of trophies taken one grueling duel at a time, was rendered almost quaint by comparison, a relic of an older, more personal kind of warfare that the galaxy's true hidden master had never actually needed once his final mechanism was ready to be triggered. He died believing, as far as anyone can determine from what fragments of his private thoughts survived him, that he had served a cause of his own choosing, avenging a wife and a homeland and a body that had been stolen from him through institutional injustice. He blamed the Jedi Order for enabling. He never learned that every step of that belief had been carefully, deliberately constructed by the very same hidden power who had, in the war's final days, revealed himself as having orchestrated not merely Grievous's transformation into a weapon, but the sabotage that created the Grief in the first place, and the entire war that Grief had ultimately been recruited to serve. In this sense, Grievous's death on Utapau, however it might have felt to the galaxy at large, as a hard-won Republic victory against its single most terrifying individual enemy, was in truth merely the disposal of a tool whose usefulness to its true master had already, quietly, run its course, timed, with a precision that only made sense once the full scope of the war's final betrayal became visible in the days that followed. It is worth pausing before closing this account to address directly why Grievous's title as the single most feared Jedi killer in galactic history holds up against scrutiny in a franchise built around villains of extraordinary and varied power. The galaxy has produced Sith Lords of staggering strength, ancient dark side entities capable of consuming entire worlds, and warlords whose armies leveled civilizations. But raw power and body count alone do not fully capture what made Grievous uniquely terrifying to the Jedi Order. Specifically, and it is this specificity that earns him the title rather than diminishing it through comparison to grander cosmic threats. Sith Lords, however powerful, remained at least philosophically legible to the Jedi. A Sith could be understood, studied, and countered within the framework of the Force itself, because both traditions ultimately drew from the same well of power, however differently they chose to wield it. Grievous offered no such legibility. He was neither a fallen Jedi nor a student of the dark side. He was proof that the Force itself was not a prerequisite for becoming one of the deadliest blade wielders in galactic history, and that realization struck at something the Jedi Order had never seriously had to question before across 1,000 generations of guarding the galaxy's peace. Individual duelists throughout galactic history, Sith and Jedi alike, built their reputations against single opponents, one blade against another, decided through mastery of the same discipline both combatants shared. Grievous's threat profile broke that entire paradigm. He hunted in numbers that no single Jedi's training had ever fully prepared them to face. Four blades moving with independent, calculated purpose, turning a single confrontation into something closer to fighting. An entire squad compressed into one relentless opponent, where a Sith Lord's power might overwhelm a single Jedi through raw Force strength. Grievous overwhelmed through sheer mechanical multiplication of threat, an approach so far outside traditional lightsaber doctrine that the Order was forced to develop entirely new tactical thinking specifically to address him. A rare and telling concession from an institution that had spent 1,000 generations refining its combat philosophy into something it considered essentially complete. And then there is the matter of scale and duration, factors that separate legend from footnote in any accounting of galactic threats. Grievous did not achieve his reputation through a single dramatic confrontation or a solitary act of devastating violence. He built it patiently, methodically, across years of sustained, personal hunting that spanned the length of an entire galaxy-wide war, accumulating trophies, one grueling duel at a time, in a campaign of terror that outlasted most individual threats the Jedi Order had ever catalogued in its long history. Other villains might claim greater raw power. Few, if any, could claim a comparable sustained record of personally ending the lives of trained Jedi Knights and Masters across so many separate engagements, spread across so many different worlds, over so many years of unbroken campaign. It is this combination, mechanical brutality divorced entirely from the Force, tactical patience sustained across years rather than moments, and a body count built one deliberate, personal kill at a time rather than through any single catastrophic act, that makes the title earned rather than merely bestowed, and that ensures his story endures not as hyperbole but as one of the most genuinely unsettling chapters in the galaxy's long, blood-soaked history. This is also, in the end, precisely why his manufactured origins matter so much to a full understanding of his legend rather than diminishing it. A being who chose, from purely personal motivation, to become the greatest hunter of Jedi in galactic history would be frightening enough on those terms alone. A being who was deliberately built for that exact purpose, whose grief was cultivated as carefully as his combat reflexes, whose entire campaign of terror served an agenda he never once fully understood, even as he lived and died within it, represents something considerably more unsettling still, a reminder that the galaxy's architects of war were willing to reach into the deepest, most private tragedy of a single grieving individual and fashion from it a weapon capable of terrorizing an entire civilization's most trusted guardians for years on end. That is not a story that diminishes the fear his name inspired. It is, if anything, the very thing that makes the fear make sense, reducing a being who had once been a devoted husband and a brilliant, if ruthless, war hero into little more than a monster wrapped in scavenged trophies, a nightmare figure invoked to frighten children and to remind surviving Jedi of losses too painful to examine too closely. It is a simpler story than the truth, and in some ways a more comfortable one, because the truth is considerably darker and considerably sadder than simple monstrousness. The truth is that Grievous was made, deliberately and with considerable patience, by architects who understood precisely how to turn a grieving, broken individual's private tragedy into a weapon capable of terrorizing an entire galactic order for years, all in service of a war those same architects had planned from its very first, hidden beginning. He was not born a monster. He was built into one piece by mechanical piece, by hands that never once cared what remained of the man underneath, and set loose upon a galaxy that would spend years learning to fear him before it ever had the chance to understand exactly what and who had truly been lost. The day a shuttle fell, burning from the skies above Kaylee. In the years that followed the war's catastrophic end, as the scattered remnants of the Jedi Order who survived the Great Betrayal went into hiding across a galaxy now ruled by the very architect who had orchestrated everything from the shadows, few among them spoke openly of Grievous at all. His name had become, for many survivors, tangled inseparably with memories of colleagues and friends who never came home, and the deeper, more uncomfortable truths about his manufactured hatred and manipulated grief were simply too complicated to sit alongside the raw, personal loss that his name still evoked. It was easier, for most, to remember him simply as a monster, a cold and mechanical horror who had hunted their friends and mentors without mercy and to leave the more complicated questions about who had truly built that monster and why. For historians and archivists who would spend generations afterward trying to piece together the full, tangled truth of how the war had actually been planned and executed from its very first hidden spark on Kali itself. Meanwhile, the memory of Kimine Jai Shilal persisted in forms that bore almost no resemblance to the galaxy's wider legend of General Grievous. Among his own people, in the villages and clan halls where his name had once been spoken with pride as a war hero who had turned the tide of a generations-long conflict against the Hook, older Kalish, who remembered him from before the shuttle crash, carried a different kind of grief entirely. One built not around fear of a mechanical monster, but around the simple, aching loss of a brilliant young commander and his devoted wife, both of them stolen from their people by forces that Kali's own historians would spend decades trying to fully untangle and understand. Ronderu Lai Kumar, whose death in that engineered shuttle crash had set the entire tragedy in motion, was remembered on Kali, not as a footnote in some larger galactic conspiracy, but as a warrior and a partner whose loss had broken something in her husband that the galaxy at large would only ever know as cold, mechanical menace. There is a version of this story, rarely told and rarely remembered outside specialized historical circles, that begins not with a monster, but with two young Kalish warriors falling in love amid the brutal, generations-long grind of a war against the Hook, building a partnership on mutual respect and shared purpose that their culture considered the highest form of devotion between equals. That version of the story ends not with a duel on a windswept sinkhole world, but with a burning shuttle falling from Kali's mountainous skies, carrying away the future those two warriors might have built together, had the architects of a war not yet begun decided that a broken, grieving survivor represented a more useful instrument than a living, loving husband ever could. Both versions are true. The galaxy, in the end, only ever really learned to tell the second one. The lightsabers he collected were eventually recovered, scattered among the wreckage of Utapau's sinkhole city, and returned in fragments to whatever remained of the Jedi Order in the war's catastrophic aftermath, cold reminders of names that would be spoken quietly, if at all, in the years of scattered exile and hiding that followed the Order's near-total destruction. Each recovered blade represented not merely a name lost to Grievous's collection, but an entire life that had been cut short in service of a war whose true purpose its architects had never once bothered to explain honestly to anyone. Fighting and dying within it, Jedi and clone and separatist alike, all of them pieces moved across a board whose true shape almost none of them ever fully perceived until it was far too late to matter. Those who eventually recovered and catalogued the collection, working in circumstances of tremendous secrecy and danger, given the galaxy's new political reality, found the task considerably more difficult than any simple inventory might suggest. Kyber crystals, the living heart of every lightsaber, carried faint imprints of their original bearers that a sufficiently attuned individual could sometimes sense, fragments of personality and purpose that lingered long after the being who first attuned that crystal had fallen. Working through Grievous's collection meant, for those tasked with the grim duty, brushing up against dozens of these fading imprints in succession, an experience that more than one survivor of the war's final catastrophe would later describe as among the most quietly devastating tasks they were ever asked to perform. a slow, deliberate confrontation with the full scale of what one being's campaign of terror had actually cost, blade by blade, across years of relentless, patient hunting. His name, meanwhile, endured in a different form entirely, spoken not as a eulogy, but as a warning, a story told across 1,000 worlds about exactly how far a broken heart could be twisted, and exactly how patient and how monstrous the architects of a galaxy-spanning war had been willing to be in order to win. Children across the galaxy, in the years and decades that followed the war's end, grew up hearing fragments of his legend, told and retold in forms that grew steadily more distorted with each passing generation, until the being who had once been Jai Shilal existed in popular memory almost entirely as a cautionary myth, a four-armed nightmare wrapped in stolen lightsabers, invoked to frighten and to warn, rather than remembered as the tragic, manufactured product of a war whose true architect had understood, better than almost anyone else in galactic history, exactly how to turn a single grieving heart into an instrument capable of terrorizing an entire civilization for years on end. Somewhere beneath every retelling of his legend, beneath every trophy and every terrified whisper, there remains the quieter, sadder truth of who he had once been before the Durasteel and the vengeance and the endless hunting. A truth the galaxy mostly forgot to mourn because it was so much easier, in the end, to simply be afraid. And perhaps that, more than anything else, is the final and most enduring lesson buried within the entire terrible story, that the galaxy's most feared monsters are so rarely born fully formed from nothing, and so much more often built, patiently and deliberately, from the wreckage of ordinary lives that someone else, somewhere else, found more useful, broken, than whole. It is a lesson worth carrying forward, long after the last echo of his coughing breath fades from the story, because it asks something harder of the listener than simple fear ever could. It asks that we remember not just what he became, but what was taken from him to make him that way. And it asks us to wonder, quietly, how many other monsters across how many other galaxies far, far away began their stories the exact same way, as someone loved, before someone else decided that love was simply another resource to be harvested for a war they never chose to fight. Picture, once more, that cloak of lightsabers hanging across a chestplate built from Durasteel and stolen breath, each blade a name, each name a story that ended somewhere on a battlefield far from home. It is easy, hearing the story told this way, to see only the monster, the four-armed nightmare that hunted Jedi across 100 worlds and wore their weapons as trophies without a flicker of remorse. It is harder, and perhaps more important, to remember what stood beneath that armor before it was ever built. A young war hero who loved his people fiercely enough to lead them through a war that had outlasted every reason for fighting it. And a husband who loved his wife fiercely enough that her murder, however deliberately engineered by hands he never once managed to identify, was enough to unmake everything he had once been and rebuild it into something the galaxy would spend years learning to fear. The most feared Jedi killer in all of history was not born wanting to be feared. He was made that way, one calculated manipulation at a time, by architects patient enough to wait years for their investment to fully mature, and cold enough to discard it the moment its usefulness expired. That is the story the galaxy rarely tells about him, because it is a far more uncomfortable story than simply calling him a monster and moving on. But it is the truer story, and perhaps, in the end, the more important one to remember. Somewhere in the quiet windswept ruins of a sinkhole city on a world called Utapau. The last fragments of a warrior named Kimenjai Shilal finally came to rest, closing a chapter of galactic history that had begun so many years before, with a shuttle falling, burning from the mountainous skies of a homeworld called Kaylee, and with a love story that the galaxy never got the chance to finish.